Welcome to Zion Recap.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're doing a really special deep dive today, tailored just for you.
Exactly.
If you're looking for, I guess, a shortcut to understanding the foundational tenets of the Christian faith without having to sift through a literal mountain of theological textbooks, you are in the exact right place.
It saves a lot of reading.
It really does. So today we are looking at a specific sermon delivered on Sunday, March 8th, 2026 at Zion CC. The message is titled, Building Your Faith on the Bedrock of Christ, and it was delivered by Pastor Roy.
And our main goal, the overarching mission of this deep dive today, is to extract the core framework laid out in that capstone sermon.
Right.
Our goal is to impartially break down what the source text describes as the fundamental blueprint for a believer. We want to equip you with a really clear understanding of the theological arguments presented regarding what it actually means to build a life on solid ground.
Especially when that ground feels like it's constantly shifting underneath us.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because context is pretty much everything here.
It really is.
The source material notes that Zion CC has actually spent the first part of the year in a series covering fundamental beliefs.
Yeah, the basics.
Right. And this specific sermon acts as the grand finale to that series. But what is really interesting about their approach is what happens next.
Which is pretty rare, honestly.
Yeah, they aren't moving on to like a topical series based on whatever cultural issue happens to be trending online right now. The text mentions they're heading straight back into a chapter-by-chapter, verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts.
Which is a highly intentional pedagogical choice on their part.
All right.
In the theological world, that is often called expository preaching.
Okay.
And Pastor Roy specifically argues in the sermon that teaching verse by verse prevents a church leadership team from only focusing on their pet subject.
Oh, or their personal favorites.
Exactly. It forces the community to spend the exact same amount of time on a really difficult or uncomfortable topic that the biblical authors spent writing about it.
You can't just skip the hard parts.
Right, you can't just gloss over it. The stated goal of this method is to confront the listener with the full scope of the text rather than a curated, highly palatable version of it.
And that desire for an unvarnished approach really sets the stage for the primary scripture of this sermon, which is Hebrews chapter 6, verse 1.
Yeah.
The writer of Hebrews is essentially pleading with the early believers, telling them they need to stop endlessly circling the elementary, basic teachings and finally move on to maturity.
Yet the sermon presents a vital counterpoint to that ancient critique.
How so?
Well, even though these are considered elementary teachings, the text notes that Zion CC revisits them yearly.
Oh, I see.
The underlying argument is that humans are incredibly prone to amnesia. We just forget the basics.
We really do.
Or worse, we actively compromise them under pressure. So to combat that, the sermon uses this passage in Hebrews to outline a three-part framework for the believer.
Okay, what are the three parts?
Those three pillars are inner decisions, outer behaviors, and future hope.
Inner decisions, outer behaviors, future hope. Let's start with that first pillar, the inner decisions. The source material paints this as the internal landscape. Our attitudes, our hidden motivations, the thoughts we allow to take up space in our minds when literally no one else is watching.
The private stuff.
Exactly. The sermon anchors this in Philippians chapter 2, verse 13, which seems to completely flip the script on how modern culture views personal righteousness or, moral achievement.
It really does.
The text argues that the very desire to obey God is actually a gift from God himself.
It's a massive perspective shift regarding human agency.
It is.
The sermon's premise is that a person isn't inherently good or spiritually superior simply because they have a sudden desire to obey the Lord.
Right.
That desire is framed as God actively working internally, sanctifying the believer.
Which basically means he's gradually cleaning up a person's inner life.
Precisely. Pruning away toxic habits so they look more like Jesus. It's really designed to take the pressure off of human striving. However, the text is careful to note that while the desire originates from God, there is still a strict expectation of active human participation.
Wait, so if the desire comes from God, but human participation is required, how does the sermon bridge that gap practically? Does it give examples of what that participation actually looks like?
It does. The message moves directly into Colossians chapter 3, verse 5.
Okay.
The theological command there is to actively strip off the old sinful nature.
Strip it off.
Right. It requires the believer to consciously put to death earthly mentalities that are lurking within. And the sermon brings this ancient directive right into the 21st century.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it specifically highlights the modern, very relatable struggle with anger, rage, malicious behavior, and slander.
That feels incredibly relevant for anyone listening right now.
Doesn't it?
I mean, we live in an era of constant doom scrolling and hyper-awareness. We have 24/7 access to global injustices, the brutal intricacies of war, political corruption, and stories of people suffering for their beliefs.
It's overwhelming.
It is very easy to feel completely consumed by rage. But the sermon issues a very specific directive here, right?
It issues a highly challenging one. The argument is that the follower of Jesus must reject the cultural default of perpetual outrage.
Wow.
The source material explicitly calls believers to move away from rage and toward prayer and faith.
There was a specific quote from the transcript that painted such a vivid picture of this.
Yeah.
Pastor Roy said that being irritated in Little Syracuse, Indiana, isn't changing anything in the world, but the prayer of a just person avails much.
That contrast is stark.
It really is. You have people sitting in their living rooms thousands of miles away from global conflicts, just seething with anxiety, convinced their anger is somehow a righteous contribution to the world.
When it's really not doing anything.
Exactly. The sermon argues that this kind of rage is entirely useless, whereas prayer actually shifts reality.
What's fascinating here is how this transitions into the biblical concept of repenting from dead works.
Dead works?
Right. The sermon clarifies that dead works aren't just the obvious, glaring moral failures or sins.
Okay.
Dead works are also the insidious trap of a transactional, checklist-based faith.
A checklist?
Yeah, it is the human attempt to earn what the Christian text claims God freely gives.
Let me make sure I'm following this.
Yeah.
Are we talking about a checklist mentality here, like someone trying to rack up spiritual karma points to force God's hand?
That is a great way to put it. It's the idea that if a person performs 3 specific religious duties this week, God is somehow indebted to them.
Right, like a transaction.
Exactly. The sermon critiques this as an exhausting attempt to gain favor based entirely on human energy and finite resources.
Because we run out of energy.
We do. The speaker notes that these dead works might make a person feel accomplished for a brief moment, but eventually the individual runs out of energy to exchange.
Right.
True faith, according to the message, is the exact opposite. It involves placing one's foundation entirely on God's completed work, rather than trying to manipulate divine outcomes through human effort.
And according to the source material, making that shift from dead works to true faith leads directly to a very specific promise found in John 10:10.
Yes.
The sermon contrasts 2 very different agendas. The agenda of the thief is only to steal, kill, and destroy.
Right.
And Pastor Roy points out that when tragedy strikes in a broken world, the human reflex is often to blame God. But the sermon argues that stealing, killing, and destroying is absolutely not God's calling card.
Not at all.
Jesus' stated agenda is that humanity may have life and have it abundantly.
And the text defines that abundant life as an active, vibrant existence, even in the midst of worldly brokenness.
I love that phrase they used.
Human beings, not human do-nothings.
Yes, that one.
It's very memorable. The abundant life isn't passive. It involves stepping into specific callings and ministries, fueled by a restful faith rather than the exhaustion of dead works.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because the sermon argues that all of those inner decisions, the rejection of rage, the move away from dead works, they naturally have to spill over into the physical, tangible world.
I can't just stay internal.
Exactly. That brings us to the second pillar of the framework, outer behaviors. The source text narrows in on 2 very physical actions demanded of believers: baptism and the laying on of hands.
And the sermon takes a completely uncompromising stance on baptism,
It really does.
rooting its argument in Matthew 28.19 and Acts 2.38. The source material makes it abundantly clear that baptism is not presented as a mere suggestion.
Or an optional symbolic gesture for the ultra-devout.
Right. The text cites Jesus' command to go and make disciples, baptizing them. The speaker states bluntly that if a believer remains unbaptized, they are walking in active disobedience.
The pastor actually acknowledged the social friction of this.
He did.
He noted in the transcript, "I know it's going to hurt sometimes, but I don't want you to misunderstand." It requires a level of public vulnerability to stand up in front of a crowd and declare a belief system.
It takes courage.
Definitely. And from there, the sermon moves to the laying on of hands. This stood out to me because It's a practice that seems so foreign to modern secular culture.
Yeah, the idea of physical touch having spiritual weight.
Exactly.
It's a remarkably versatile biblical practice, actually, and the sermon outlines several distinct purposes for it, backed by Scripture.
Okay.
The text references Mark 7 for physical healing and Matthew 19 for the blessing of children.
The text also mentions Acts chapter 8 regarding the receiving of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
But the application that seemed most prevalent for their specific community was from Acts 13, where hands are laid on people to commission them as missionaries.
Which is such a powerful visual.
It really is.
Yeah.
The sermon shared some current examples from Zion CC. They recently practiced this by laying hands on Pastor Roy's own parents, who were ministering in Mexico, as well as a young man named Aiden, who was heading off to a Bible institute.
Wow.
It acts as a physical, communal send-off.
It really bridges the gap between the spiritual and the physical. However, because the sermon deals heavily with spiritual actions and the receiving of spiritual gifts, it introduces a vital caveat.
What's that?
The speaker issues a strong, explicit warning regarding discernment. The congregation is instructed to judge every single teaching and prophetic word strictly against Scripture.
But isn't judging a spiritual leader often discouraged in certain religious circles?
Oh, frequently.
I feel like we constantly see documentaries about environments where questioning the leader is strictly forbidden.
You are absolutely right, which is why this portion of the sermon is so significant. The speaker actively encourages scrutiny.
He welcomes it.
He does. He insists that the congregation must judge every word, whether it is coming from him directly behind the pulpit or from a charismatic personality on TikTok.
Especially on TikTok.
Especially there. The sermon specifically warns against online influencers who claim their words are untouchable or beyond judgment. The underlying argument is that true biblical teaching welcomes investigation, which is why the sermon itself relies so heavily on direct scriptural references rather than personal philosophy.
That emphasis on critical thinking and robust theology becomes essential as the sermon transitions into the third and final pillar of the framework: future hope and heavy realities.
That part is heavy.
It is. This section addresses the resurrection of the dead and eternal judgment. And to fully grasp the weight of this, we really need to look at the context of what the Zion CC community was experiencing at the time of this recording.
Yeah.
The source text reveals a staggering amount of recent grief. In just 1 month, their church family lost 3 members: a 6-month-old baby, a 25-year-old, and an 80-year-old.
It is a profound level of communal trauma.
Unimaginable.
When a community is hit with the loss of an infant or a young adult, the theological frameworks they hold are tested to their absolute limits.
Without a doubt.
What stands out in the transcript is that the sermon does not attempt to offer empty, overly spiritualized platitudes.
Thank goodness.
Right. It doesn't ask the congregation to pretend everything is fine, nor does it attempt to mathematically explain why God allowed these specific tragedies to occur.
Instead, it points them toward how a community practically survives the storm. The sermon anchors their acute grief entirely in the biblical promise of the resurrection.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sermon makes a critical theological distinction about how Christianity views mortality.
How so?
The text points out that the Bible never asks believers to view death as a natural, beautiful part of the circle of life.
Right, it doesn't sugarcoat it.
Exactly. In the Christian worldview represented here, death is an unnatural intrusion. It's described as the final enemy.
The final enemy.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is a source of profound, legitimate sorrow.
But the sermon pivots on the belief that this enemy was definitively defeated.
Right.
The core argument is that because Jesus was bodily resurrected from the grave, believers have an unbreakable guarantee that they too will be resurrected.
Jesus is the prototype.
Exactly. The text presents him as the first of many. For a grieving community, this doctrine isn't just an abstract theological concept.
No, not at all.
It is the absolute bedrock that allows them to anticipate a literal physical reunion with those they have lost.
And that doctrine of resurrection inevitably leads the sermon to address the concept of eternal judgment.
Yeah.
Specifically referencing Hebrews 9:27. Now, the concept of judgment in hell is highly controversial and often a source of fear or skepticism.
Oh, absolutely.
The source material tackles the common cultural objection. Why would a loving God send someone to a place of eternal torment?
And the way the sermon reframes that question is fascinating. It doesn't describe God as an angry judge forcefully throwing people away.
No, it frames judgment through the lens of human autonomy.
Economy.
Right. The sermon's argument is that God simply honors the ultimate trajectory of a person's earthly choices.
Okay.
The speaker explains that if an individual spends their life desiring to be close to God, they will be close to Him in eternity. Conversely, if an individual uses their earthly life to actively distance themselves from God, God will respect that choice. Wow. And they will remain far from Him eternally. It is framed less as a punitive banishment and more as the tragic honoring of free will.
And the sermon emphasizes that this trajectory is set during our lifetime. There's no post-death waiting period to change course.
Right.
That urgency is why the sermon stresses the importance of building on the right foundation now. The text references the famous passage in Matthew chapter 7, verse 24.
A house on the rock?
Right. Contrasting a house built on solid rock with one built on sand. The reality acknowledged by the sermon is that living in a broken world guarantees storms.
They are coming.
The rain will fall and the winds will violently beat against the house.
And the crucial takeaway from that passage is that the presence of a severe storm, like the tragic loss of 3 community members, does not mean a person is built on the wrong foundation.
That's a really important distinction.
It is. The proof of the bedrock is not the absence of weather.
Yeah.
The proof is that the structure does not collapse when the weather hits. And surviving that storm requires the active daily choice to obey Christ's teachings, not just passively audit them.
Which brings us to a highly practical, personal story Pastor Roy used to close out the sermon.
I love this story.
It perfectly illustrates the tension between passive hearing and active faith. According to the transcript, Pastor Roy and his wife decided to take up snowboarding.
Okay.
They get out on the mountain, take some lessons, and right away, his wife is a natural. She's effortlessly carving down the hill.
But the sermon notes that the pastor, however, had a vastly different introduction to the sport.
He really paints a pretty humbling picture of himself.
Yeah, he does.
He admits he spent the entire session essentially falling on his backside. He would stand up, instantly wipe out, get back up, and wipe out again.
Over and over.
It reached a point where he was utterly exhausted and ready to quit the sport entirely. That's when the instructor finally pulled him aside to diagnose the issue.
And the instructor gave him a fundamental lesson in physics. He told the pastor, "Roy, you are not on flat ground. You are on a hill, but you are trying to balance as if you are standing on flat ground."
The instructor explained that gravity is constantly pulling you down the mountain. If you want to maintain control of the snowboard, your natural human instinct is completely wrong.
Instinct tells you to lean back.
Exactly. You lean back, away from the slope, to protect yourself.
Why?
But the instructor told him he had to lean into the gravity.
Lean in.
If you want to carve right, you have to lean hard to the right. To go left, you lean left. Because he kept leaning backward out of fear, he lost his edge and repeatedly crashed. So what does this all mean?
The sermon utilizes this as a metaphor for navigating the Christian journey in a fractured world.
Okay.
The spiritual application is that a believer cannot survive by leaning back, keeping a safe, passive distance from the teachings of their faith.
Right.
If a person treats their spiritual life like they are standing on safe, flat ground, the sheer gravity of worldly cynicism, grief, and dead works will inevitably take them out.
It'll just pull them down.
Exactly. The directive is that believers must lean in.
And the sermon is quick to point out that leaning in is almost impossible to do in isolation.
It really is.
When your every instinct screams at you to lean back and protect yourself from getting hurt, you need a community.
Yeah.
The text argues that this is the primary function of the church. A group of people designed to catch you, challenge your dead works, and encourage you to lean into the bedrock when you are exhausted.
Which is why the source material concludes with a very direct call to action for its community. It is a clear push against isolation.
Exactly. For those listening who want to explore these specific invitations, Zion CC actively encourages people to get involved.
They want you there.
They really do. The church invites anyone looking for clarification or who wants to discuss these sermon topics in person to attend their small groups on Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m.
Wednesday at 6:30.
Right. It's their primary environment for diving deeper into the material and asking difficult questions. We'd love to talk with you in person.
And the church also invites you to catch their latest sermons by joining them on Sundays at either 9:00 a.m. or 11:00 a.m.
9 or 11.
Right. And connecting back to the challenge to move from rage to prayer, they encourage their community to sign up for 30-minute monthly prayer slots to actively fill up their prayer board.
And as a reminder, we have only synthesized the core themes today. To hear Pastor Roy's complete, unedited message, including all the nuances we couldn't cover, you should head over to Zion CC's YouTube page.
You don't want to miss the full thing.
Definitely not. You can find the full video by searching for the title, Building Your Faith on the Bedrock of Christ.
Before we wrap up, please note that Zion uses AI tools to help summarize information, sermons, and common questions. While we work hard to keep everything accurate, AI can sometimes make mistakes or hallucinate.
Thank you so much for joining us for this recap today.
We talked a lot today about the difference between dead works and true faith. As you go about your week, look closely at your own routines. Are the things you're doing for God secretly just a way to try and control Him? Or are they a true, joyful response to the abundant life He's already given you?